Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen, we are canning some home-pressed apple juice. And so I have a previous video that was just out on using my apple cider press to press cider. In the United States, we call cider basically unfiltered apple juice, as opposed to most of the rest of the world where they refer to cider means alcoholic. So cider means like about the alcohol of a beer. And I am going to show you some of that as well in a later video. But for us, in our purposes, when we say cider, we just mean unfiltered apple juice. And I did strain this when I was pouring it from the original pressing into the jars and the containers that I had to store it with. That was last Saturday, so this has been sitting for, today's Thursday, so it's been sitting for about 5 days, so definitely time to get to it. I didn't want to let it sit fresh any longer, even though it was refrigerated. Homemade fresh apple juice has a lot of natural yeast and bacteria on it. It's just part of the process, and so it will start to ferment even in a refrigerator if you let it sit for very long. And there's an old kind of funny saying about like home-pressed apple cider that if you drink too much of it at once, it will very much flush your system out, because it's a whole lot of probiotics, so to speak, that are in there that, especially the longer it sits, the more active it gets, and it will clean you out pretty good. So the process to make apple juice so that it's now shelf stable is we're going to heat it and then we're going to can it, and it's very brief. Apple cider by itself is generally quite acidic, although there's been some recent studies done, the National Center for Home Food Preservation in conjunction with Ball, so they got together on this project, looked at the acidity of a whole lot of different apples that are at the grocery store. You know, our apple varieties keep changing over the years and they keep getting sweeter and sweeter. They are getting slightly less acidic, and so there are now some recipes out there for things like apple sauce that will include a little bit of lemon juice in order to just make sure that the acidity is enough. But the word on the street is that all of those older recipes are still perfectly safe. It's just an added layer of security to add lemon juice. I did not add lemon juice to this. If you look at the National Center for Home Food Preservation, or the book that they are responsible for, which is this one called So Easy to Preserve, their recipe is a pretty old recipe where it calls for getting apple juice from a cider mill if you can get it, and then you bring it to a boil, you put it in the jars, and you process the jars for 5 minutes for pints and quarts, 10 minutes for half gallons. By the way, this is one of the few. I love that my neighbors right now, I have one back here mowing, and now I have another one that's like weed whacking. It's like the one time I decided to go back out on my front porch, everybody is doing work. So ignore the side noises that are going on, I apologize. The half-gallon jars, one of the only things that you can actually can in half-gallon jars, and those are those really big jars, are apple juice and grape juice. There are no other recipes for half-gallon jars. I have a ton of them because I use them for dry storage for many things, so they're fabulous for that. And I occasionally actually do can apple juice in them because it's nice sometimes. This time of year when you're having a lot of mulled cider and hot cider in the evenings when it's chilly, you'll go through a half-gallon pretty fast. But that is the only time that you can use half-gallon jars for canning. Their recipe gives pints and quarts 5 minutes, half-gallon jars 10 minutes. I would not recommend using that. I would recommend using the Ball recipe instead. And the reason for that is if you only process something for 5 minutes, you have to boil your jars ahead of time in order to sterilize them. Anything 10 minutes or longer, you do not have to sterilize your jars before you put your product into it. They just need to be clean, and they need to be warm enough that they're not going to thermally shock when you put your product into them. But you don't need to boil them ahead of time. That saves a tremendous amount of time. And so add 5 minutes if you're using that recipe, because the Ball recipe, and this is out of this Ball Blue Book, and it may be in some of their other books as well, but this is kind of a classic, canning 101 recipe, and so it's in the Ball Blue Book. They suggest two different things. One is they suggest bringing it up to 185, 190 degrees and heating it there for 5 minutes, not bringing it to a full boil. And the reason for that is this cloudiness that you see in there is actually some of the natural pectins that are in the fruit. And if you bring those to a boil, they will actually set, and you will always have a cloudy product. I don't really care one way or the other. It doesn't matter to me. But I also think you get a fresher taste if you don't bring it to a full boil. And I'm also making some hard cider. And for the hard cider recipe, you also just pasteurize it by bringing it to 185, 190 degrees. You don't bring it to a full boil, because in the case of a hard cider, you want it to be clear if you can get it clear. Both recipes, I think in both books, suggest that you take your cider and let it sit for 24 to 48 hours in order for whatever sediments that are in there to fall out. And you'll see that in this video where I do pour out the juice that's on the top and discard that sediment that's in the bottom. And again, that's some natural pectins that are in there, and they're very, very fine, because I did run this stuff through a coffee filter before I processed it. And so that sediment that's left in those jars is just still in there from the natural fruit. It's not big chunks of anything. But I did discard that. Same thing for the hard cider that you'll see later. And then they actually give a recipe for how to make apple juice if you don't have a cider press. So this is kind of handy. Wash the apples, core them, seed them, chop them coarsely. And they say combine, this is 12 pounds of apples. They say combine apples and water. So a quart of water, 12 pounds of apples in a large saucepan, and cook until the apples are tender, stirring to prevent sticking. Strain apples through a damp jelly bag or several layers of cheesecloth to extract the juice. Heat juice for 5 minutes at 190. Do not boil juice. And this is supposed to yield 6 pints. That would be 3 quarts of juice. So 3 quarts of juice from 12 pounds of apples, and obviously are going to be slightly watered down because you're adding a little bit of water just so that things don't burn. But that is how you make apple juice if you don't actually have a press. So that's really good information to have, because most of us don't have a home press. You can use a steam juicer if you have a steam juicer. Those also work very well. The one thing to recognize about a steam juicer is that steam is not disappearing. It's actually going into your juice. And so I find once I've opened the jar, the shelf stableness in the refrigerator is a lot less with steam juicer juices than it is with a cider press where I've actually just squeezed just cider juice. There's probably a slight acidity change, and it just hasn't been diluted by extra liquid. But steam juicers can work really great for apples, and so that's another option as well if you don't have a cider press. So yeah, for the ball recipe, 190, not boiling. And then the processing time on this is 10 minutes for pints and quarts. So they added that 5 minutes so that you don't have to sterilize your jars ahead of time. Chef's kiss. Definitely a time saver and worth doing. And so I followed the ball recipe for this recipe instead of following the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the So Easy to Preserve recipe. The other thing you can do with this, if you want to give it for Christmas gifts, or if you know you're going to be using it around the holidays when, mulled ciders and things are delicious, you can throw a small piece of cinnamon stick in here. You can put a couple of cloves in here. You could put a couple of allspice, whole cloves into this. Know that in general, the longer something like that sits, the stronger it's going to get. And so go easy. I actually, when I put cinnamon sticks in these kind of things, I tend to break them up and just put a small piece in there instead of a whole cinnamon stick, because it can get really, really strong if it sits for a long period of time. But one year we pressed apples and I gave everybody a quart of canned cider, and it was spiced. And so that was a really nice holiday treat to just give to people, where they could just warm it up in their microwave. They didn't even have to put it on the stove, and it was basically already mulled. So there's an idea for you as well. I wouldn't do that with something that I thought I was going to let sit on my shelf for a year, just because I think it would be super crazy strong if it had been sitting for that length of time. But really great on the shelf. I often use this throughout the year for smoothies. And then this time of year, obviously, we're just drinking it as a hot beverage in a mug on a cold night, because it's just lovely and cozy. So homemade apple cider, canned. Let's get started. So this is my cider right from the cider press that's been filtered through a coffee filter, and then it's been in refrigeration and sitting for 5 days. You can see the sediment that has sifted out towards the bottom there that is very, very fine. And I am just very carefully pouring off the juice without disturbing a lot of that sediment. I'm going to get a little bit in there, and it's not a big deal, but because it's so nicely sifted out at this point, I'm going to try to avoid pouring it back into the big pot. You can see how cloudy that is, and that's just pectin. I love that there's a leaf stuck on the bottom of this jar. Thankfully, I didn't manage to throw that into the pot. So I've got 4 of these quarts A couple of other quarts went to other projects. And then here's the big pot of cider that I didn't have jars for. I put a bunch in jars because we were giving it to people and I didn't know how much we were going to give away. And so I had some of them in jars and some of them in the big pot. And again, trying to leave behind that sediment that's in the bottom there. By the way, I got these big pots at estate sales. Always look for stainless steel large pots at estate sales. They are a much better deal. Currently, this juice is at 78 degrees. It had been sitting out on my counter for an hour or so. Here's the apple cider that I've started to make. And so there's a couple of jars of raw cider and then some Bragg's apple cider with the mother added in to let that brew. Our cider has come up to 185, 190, and I've let it cook for about 5 minutes. And then I'm pouring that directly into my clean jars. I'm getting juice everywhere. And sorry for the pizza stone here. I needed a flat surface that I could put here. That I didn't want to put this on plastic because it was too wobbly and weird. So yeah, pizza stone, forgive that. But just pouring these jars, and we're going with a 1/4 inch headspace. So very small headspace here. If you have both regular and wide mouth jars, juice is a great use for regular mouth jars instead of wide mouth jars. I like to save my wide mouth jars for things that are chunky, that are harder to put in the jar. So I often can juices and liquids in general in regular mouth jars. You can see I'm dripping down the side of my big pot here. I got it all over my stove. I don't know why we can't invent measuring cups that don't drip everywhere. Topping these off to a 1/4 inch, so really close to the top there. Wiping our rims, everything's pretty sticky, and so you want to make sure that things are cleaned off so that you get a good seal. And then new lids. There are people out there that reuse canning lids. It's not something I'm willing to risk for the 25 cents that it cost me for a new lid. But this would be a good project if you had used lids and you were determined to reuse them. This is a good instance of where it would be worthy to do that because it's not something that's going to be processed for very long. So rings, we're ready to go in the canner. And then because of everything configured on my stove the way it is, I'm putting it behind into my canner water. This does get moved forward. And I end up ultimately changing. I have 2 big pots that are kind of this size. One of them is slightly bigger and deeper. I ended up shifting everything out. This was just, it kept boiling over and turning off the burner because I have a gas stove. And so I ended up, after it came to a boil and was kind of a mess, I switched it out and put it in the bigger pot. And you can see here, I'm an inch over, but it's just right up to the top of the line there. And so it was a little bit too full for this canner. Bring it to a full boil, rolling boil, start your timer, 10 minutes, and then turn your stove off, let it sit in the canner for another 5 minutes. This just helps with seals and it keeps things from siphoning. And there it is, beautiful apple juice that is shelf stable. I have some apple pear juice on my shelf right now that is from 2021. So this holds very well and is just lovely to have on your shelves. And again, this is the one instance where if you've got a big family, you'll go through a 1/2 gallon of this very quickly. It's nice to have those 1/2 gallon jars, but you do have to have a really tall pot in order to can in those. There you have it. Definitely worthy of pantry shelves. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, stay tuned. I have more cider adventures coming up. And be sure to give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.